Michael asked me to do this, I knew that Discuss had a format which was adversarial, and maybe even a little bit antagonistic. And yeah, I was adamant that I didn't want to take part in such a debate, and that's when we had that conversation a couple of months ago. But, you know, given the state of the world right now, where, you know, people are pushing towards extremes, people are taking up adversarial positions, the debate is polarising. I really think that we should start pushing back against that. I'm really much more interested in people who will find common ground. That sounds almost old-fashioned, but it's something that I believe in. One nation under a groove. Okay, and while I'm on the state of the world, I'm also, obviously we need to say that since we set up this discussion, the United Kingdom has left the EU. Now that is going to have a massive effect on arts and culture, but we don't know what yet. So anything that I say over the next 15 minutes, which is how long Michael's given me to speak, we do have to realise that actually some of what I might say, well, I think it's all relevant, but some of it might seem actually very minor compared to the challenge that we will all have over the next couple of years and the next couple of decades in dealing with what it's like to be in arts and culture in the UK outside the EU, which actually frightens me. And I know it frightens people who are working in the cultural institutions in Greater Manchester already. We also have to realise that George Osborne, who's one of my least favourite people in the whole wide world, is now no longer part of the cabinet. One of his pet projects was the Northern Powerhouse. We don't know whether that... first of all, we don't know what kind of pet that pet project was. We don't know if it was a cuddly little cat or a snake that's going to bite us. But is Theresa May going to carry on with that project? And again, that might have ramifications. And thirdly, there's a new culture secretary. She's called Karen Bradley. And I know nothing about her. But again, she's going to have an influence, isn't she? So everything that I say, in a way, I have to ask you to bear in mind that that's the bigger picture. And all that bigger picture will influence what happens in Manchester. Okay, so I would like to just begin by celebrating the high-profile cultural institutions of Manchester. The refurbishment of the Whitworth was fantastic. The reopening of Home was a success. MIF has a new director, and I've already met with him a couple of times, and I know he's already reached out into the grassroots of Manchester cultural activity in a way, I'm allowed to say this, in a way that maybe Alex Poots didn't. There's certainly a new kind of MIF being born as we speak, and which will come into the city this time next year. Royal Exchange, fantastic. I mean, especially anything that Maxine Peake is in, basically. Jeremy Deller's We Are Here project, which was amazing all around Manchester and the centenary of the Somme. So a lot of the high-profile stuff I want to celebrate, and the point I'm trying to make is not, again, not antagonistic, adversarial, but to say, given that high profile and given that achievement, what happens next? Okay. So I do harbour some reservations. I'd just like to quickly say that I've worked in the cultural sector, which we never called it that in the 1980s, let's be honest. I've worked I've run a fanzine, I've run a record label, I put on 200 live gigs, 2,000 club events, spoken word, zine fairs, all kinds of things for 30 years or more. And I've worked alongside actors, filmmakers, musicians, poets, graphic designers. And for most of that 30 years, I felt in a parallel world to the cultural institutions in Manchester. I felt they did not care what me and my friends were doing. I felt like the drawbridge had been completely lifted and we were on the outside, on the other side of the moat, while the well-funded cultural institutions were just getting on with what they were doing, oblivious to what we were doing, and in fact not even valuing what we were doing. And for 27 years, that's the world that I lived in. More recently, a ridiculous time lag, the drawbridge dropped, and there were a couple of cultural institutions, including MIF, that just gave me a little bit of a foot in the door. But in those, probably it was 27 years of work before that happened. In that 27 years, I felt part of and energised by an independent alternative arts culture in the city. We did it ourselves. That DIY ethic, making something out of nothing, was so important to us. Like I say, this is the 1980s. We didn't expect any funding. And as a result of that, a lot of people actually had to pull out of cultural activity. And a lot of people went down to London. There was a brain drain, and there still is a brain drain that we need to think about. But we did take strength from each other. We did find allies. We did find a way of working. And I always take particular strength from, I think, probably the most instructive episode in our cultural history, which concerns Sheila Delaney in Salford 60 years ago. Going to the Palace Theatre to see a Terence Rattigan play. Going to one of those cultural institutions to see a very mainstream play. She was on a date with a boy that she never saw again, as it happens. But she was also not only disappointed by the boy, but disappointed by the play. And she went home and she changed what was a novel that she was writing called A Taste of Honey into a play. And as you know, that is quite rightly now regarded as one of the great British plays of the last 100 years. If she could do it, working part-time in a milk depot, we can all do it. But point one. For those 30 years that I've been around doing stuff, I've always felt like we've been operating on a skewed definition of what cultural regeneration is. And it's one that privileges the funding of buildings that house the city centre's cultural institutions. Creating good spaces for culture consumers, it does have a key role to play. But I think that's the limit of the ambition too often. The limit of the ambition of the arts and culture strategy in the city. It's that desire to build emporia in the city centre that looked great in a tourist brochure. Last year, Sir Richard Leese, our council leader, wrote in The Guardian, and he called those sparkly buildings the city's cultural provision, which he says draws in tourism, attracts wider inward investment by positioning the city as an international centre for culture and the arts. But those buildings are just bricks and mortar. And I'm much more interested in the quality and the significance of what goes on in those buildings. As ever, I refer it back to the world of clubs and venues. That's my world. Tiger in the Printworks could install every disco light ever invented. The DJs could play every #1 record Calvin Harris has ever recorded, back to back, all night, every night, with the cheapest drinks anyone has ever bought in the centre of Manchester, and that place will never have the cultural significance of the Star and Garter. In all things, the margins, not the mainstream, give a city its authenticity, its quirks, and its soul. So the assumption that culture in the city is whatever is contained in those buildings is simply not true. Much that's great about culture in this city exists outside the cultural institutions, in the dodgy venues, the rehearsal rooms, the uncontrolled spaces, the artist studios, the basements, and the streets. And the language that Sir Richard uses is instructive. Cultural provision. Something provided for us. Something we have an entirely passive relationship to. The idea that art and culture is solely something we consume. Is this the way that the arts establishment and the city's political leaders see arts and culture in the city? Marketing and consumerism are the two worst reasons to generate cultural activity. Point two. Finally comes to point two. Culture in the city cannot be just a pawn in Manchester's relentless civic boosterism. There has to be room for critical voices. That's art. It's a mean to express, to document, to reimagine, to question ourselves and the world and our city. Associated point. Funders, city planners, property developers, they can design and build glitzy venues from now until the apocalypse, but the fact is, great ideas come from the margins. Sheila Delaney, her urge to create was born out of frustration with the mainstream. Joy Division, rehearsing in the Black Swan pub in Weast. And all over the world, great ideas come from the margins. Hip-hop was born in the Bronx. Picasso, when he lived in Paris, he spent more time in cabaret clubs like the Lapin Agile than he ever did in the Louvre. I wasn't there, but I know this to be true. Okay, so moving on. Who are the consumers of this cultural provision? Who are the people accessing this? Because engagement and access is a huge issue, not just in Manchester, but nationwide, and it's deep-rooted. And the running down of arts education doesn't help. But just because it's a big issue, in the same way that social inequality is a big issue, and has been for a long time, it doesn't mean we shouldn't try to improve the situation. We need to. Is there a strategy, the political will, or the funding to widen interest in arts and culture in the city? Okay, there are many great outreach projects and programmes and initiatives run by the likes of Contact, Z Arts, Royal Exchange, Whitworth, etc. But room for expansion and reinvention of these initiatives is obvious. I've got a suggestion. For example, just one. Why don't we create links, formal links between the city centre's landmark cultural institutions and every neighbourhood, every school, every community centre. And I mean formal links. A school paired with a major cultural institution. Parents and children encouraged to visit, but also reciprocal visits and mentoring offered to pupils. If just a tiny proportion of the amount of money spent on bricks and mortar was available to widen the demographic, imagine what could be achieved. And I don't think it is purely about money. It isn't purely about the cost in terms of engaging in the arts. I mean, this event tonight, it could be free, it could be £2. I don't know how many more people would come, because I don't know how many people are engaged or disengaged. Because although money is a barrier, there are mental, social and cultural barriers too. We have to remove those barriers. We have to start at an early age. That's why I suggest schools. We have to build engagement. We have to sow seeds. We have to create a deep ecology. So it's not just the high-profile cultural institutions, but it's a deep ecology that goes all the way to schools, to nursery schools, to families, to neighbourhoods. We have to remove any social and cultural resistance to engagement in the arts that are faced by anybody. Okay, so that's about consumers, but I'm actually also perhaps even more interested in people who want to produce culture. Because Manchester is always as culturally alive as it was in those so-called glory days. It's alive with self-organising, independent individuals and collectives dreaming and creating against all the odds. And you will find them now in 2016. Places like Islington Mills, spoken word events like Bad Language, activities like Video Jam, Flair Festival, Manchester Print Fair, bands, fanzine, promoters, organisations like Rogue Studios, Instigate Arts, all kinds of cultural mayhem. But how do we build on all this and encourage the production of arts and culture in the city and not just the consumption? How do we nurture this grassroots activity? How do we celebrate the poets and the painters and the designers and the filmmakers? It's about strategy. It's about focusing our strategy on initiatives. And maybe it's also about funding. And maybe it's not about bricks and mortar. Maybe we need to intervene in ways that City Council and others haven't intervened. Are the pathways to success that we can develop for emergent artists? And engagement goes both ways. It's mutually beneficial. I really hate that idea that cultural institutions are doing us all a great favour by reaching out to the margins. It works both ways. Because without the margins, the cultural institutions will die. Without the work and without the engagement of the margins, the cultural institutions will become irrelevant. So build more cultural emporia, if that is what you wish. But I think we should ask questions of all those cultural emporia. How do they stimulate cultural activity and artistic production in the grassroots? Okay, finally, what can we do for ourselves, people who are engaged in cultural activity in the city? There is no magic wand. We have to be resourceful, just like our forebears were, just like any generation was. No generation had it easy. No generation had a magic wand. Maybe we can learn from the commercial sector. I know that some people don't like to kind of sully themselves with the idea of money. We are artists. Let's not deal with money. We can make a life as creatives, but can we make a living? How do we make a living? We need to generate money maybe for an exhibition or an event or a space or whatever we do in order to be paid, in order to live and make a living. Where does that money come from? Because another part of the wider debate is how artists struggle to make a living. The reason museums and galleries are free is because public money is there to support the places. But we can't expect public money to be used to support all cultural activity, can we? So maybe, perhaps, we need to think of ways that we can work in order to pay the costs of creative activity, pay ourselves, and be self-sustaining, generate income. And that's my own practice, and that has always been, because for 27 years, that was the only way. I never expected anything. I didn't have the luxury of building any funding into my business model. And I never felt like I compromised by bringing commercial values into what I was doing. It actually meant I was being brave and believing in what I did. It's possible. You could be so passionate you will walk over hot coals, across valleys, up hills to find an audience. And then you give that audience a quality experience and a unique insight, and you nurture their love and their loyalty. It doesn't take cash, it takes time, it takes allies, and it takes a deep conviction in what you are doing. I have a load of suggestions for how that might be, but I'm going to finish off with just a couple. First of all, respect each other's work. Find allies, perhaps work together, perhaps form collectives, perhaps form networks, but basically respect each other's work. Secondly, something that occurred to me very recently. The idea of space in the city no longer being as cheap as it was, for example, in the 80s. And that is a problem. Why not Rochdale? Why not Oldham? The metro to Rochdale. From where I live, in leafy bohemian West Didsbury, as if you couldn't fucking guess, from where I am, it's as easy to get to Rochdale as it is to get to the northern quarter, practically. If you're looking for studio space, if you're looking for space, if you're looking for venues, why not Rochdale? Ai Weiwei, the Chinese contemporary artist and activist, his studio is 25 miles away from the airport. It's not in a bohemian quarter. I'm not even sure it's near a coffee shop. And it works for him. So, the city's arts and culture have come a long way. Shall we set some new challenges? Our goal should be a truly creative renaissance. Thank you.